little bit of time today talking to Roger Azevedo and looking a little bit at the idea of self-regulated learning in general. It's a concept that has a big impact in educational settings. So maybe we just start with, if you can tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Yes. So, good morning. Thanks, George, for
It's a pleasure to be here,
to
Roger.
be here. Absolutely. Yes. In the beautiful city of Adelaide. So, I'm a professor at University of Central Florida, trained as a cognitive psychologist, and I'm the lead scientist for the learning science cluster that we have at UCF. And so I study self-regulated learning with advanced learning technologies and humans across all ages, from middle school, high school, college, and also professionals. And we build AI-based machines to actually not only study self-regulated learning, but also to foster and support it.
So let's just dive in with the first question.
Sure.
What is self-regulated learning?
So yeah, that's a big question. There's a lot of controversy as to what SRL is. So self-regulated learning is also sometimes replaced or used along with metacognition. So which one is it? So self-regulated learning really involves one's ability, i.e. a human's ability to monitor and regulate, whether it's their cognition, their affect, their metacognition, and motivation in a particular learning context. And the question is, are they doing it accurately, and what does it involve, right? And if we can't do it accurately as humans because of some particular issue, whether you're too young, don't have the prior knowledge or the strategy, the question is, can we use technology, for example, to support that?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
No, yeah, absolutely does. So, I've heard various views of why self-regulation is particularly important, and obviously self-regulation in general builds off, or self-regulated learning builds off of the concept of self-regulation.
Absolutely.
And some of the literature I've come across really emphasize at a very young age. You can look at and say your self-regulatory capabilities are going to have a significant long-term impact, meaning if you're impulsive, risk-taking, not good at regulating your behavior, regulating yourself, that you can in some ways predict future academic success. You can predict chance of being arrested. You can even things like credit score can be predicted by that. So it seems like in general, self-regulation is a broad but a critical construct to understanding human behavior.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So we draw a lot of the literature as you're mentioning, whether it's from social psychology, clinical psychology, drug dependence, etc. And so we try to use some of those principles applied to academic achievement or learning within, whether it's in school, but it's always in school, right? It could be in industry, it can be an adult, etc. So we try to apply those techniques to thinking about in terms of learning or performance or reasoning, right? Or understanding, or even sense making. What does it mean to do that, right? So the question is, can we take some of those models and actually apply them to understanding these processes? And as you're mentioning in your question, one of the big issues is, can we predict, right, whether somebody's going to be a good self-regulatory being, and what does that entail, right? So, but unfortunately, in the literature, that's a lot what we don't have we have very few training studies, and we seem not to do a good job of looking at the long-term impact of, if we are to train someone to self-regulate, then what is the impact, right, and support along the way from a lifespan perspective.
Yeah. So I think from that end, the dynamics specifically around you're an individual who knows self-regulated learning is important, let's say as a teacher. And so let's talk from a few different lenses. So as a teacher, you know it's important. You know that developing these skill sets in your students will help them longer term success, whether you're starting at a K-12 or primary secondary level, or whether you're all the way into university environment in terms of teaching and learning. What does it look like, though, as an academic, whether it's a teacher, university prop, but what does it look like to embed self-regulated learning practices into your teaching activities?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. And again, unfortunately, the developmental psychology component, or researchers or developmental psychologists have had very little impact in SRL, just because they're a very small subset, and so we need more research. But what we can tell is that we need to do a lot more modeling, right? So I think one particular aspect is, if you're an instructor, or faculty member, or teacher, right, or even a parent, right, thinking about at home, is a lot of modeling. You should be modeling those, what is planning? What does it mean to be strategic, right? What about strategy? So you tell students, don't go use strategy X, but what does that actually look like? So you have to enact, be able to model, so that they can be able to mimic. And then get to a point, it's almost like thinking about Vygotsky, thinking about scaffolding, pulling the scaffolding away, right? So by the time you ultimately fade, you are a self-regulatory being that you don't need any external regulation, right? But I think a lot of the modeling, practice, and the feedback, and then I think the other part that's missing also is the emotions, right? We tend to neglect, very few of folks are focusing on emotions, right? And the question is, even from an anticipatory perspective, How about we tell students that, look, what you are going to be learning or what you're going to be solving is going to be challenging and difficult. So you are going to experience negative emotions, right? But the question is, can we teach them emotional regulation skills? And that we can probably borrow from the clinical sciences and social sciences. I think the biggest problem is the motivation, right? And that's what teachers complain a lot about. Like, how do we motivate students, right? Unfortunately, people talk about motivation as a unitary construct, just like they talk about, metacognition.
Yeah.
But the question is, what are those motivational processes? Like, how do you induce or support task value? Make the student care about learning about, let's say, STEM, right? Or generate interest. Or more importantly, how do you build a self-efficacy, which seems to be the holy grail of motivation, right? So I think we need to do a lot more modeling and practice, right, and feedback. So whether it's in the classroom, but I think the technology or any kind of learning technology could support a teacher or instructor in doing so. Yeah. Does that?
Yeah, so I think certainly from a modeling end, and if you consider by the time a parent brings a child to school, many of the behavior mechanisms that they're rewarded for in the home have already been established. So at some level, it's a little unfair to the school system to have a child that is likely too young for really effective metacognitive awareness. But a lot of their attitudes, how do you deal with disappointment? How do you deal with failure? And, in many instances, you can learn those mindsets by being involved in sports, right? You're playing baseball or hockey or rugby, hypothetically, and you're involved in nobody plays cricket though, but you're involved in these different kinds of activities, and by engaging, you learn how to cope with those kinds of dynamics. So that's an early in the home kind of modeling. Then you have that period where they haven't really developed their metacognitive capability, and so really as an educator, you're feeling the byproduct of someone who hasn't had that modeling effect that you just talked about. What do you do at that stage pre-development? And I should even ask, is there an age, do we know at which age metacognitive capabilities begin to become more pronounced, in individuals?
So what the literature indicates is about 7 to 10 years of age is when you start developing theory of mind and you start becoming aware of your metacognition, and also aware that you do have a cognitive architecture, that you can exert certain control, right? That is your own. So that's one issue. I like your question also because it relates to another big problem that we have in the literature, is this issue of transfer, right? So we're not doing a very good job as parents or instructors or even faculty in terms of how do you train or teach a student, right, that self-regulatory skills can be applied to other contexts, right? Whether you're playing rugby, not cricket, or whether in school learning STEM, right? Or how do you bring that into a non-STEM class? Or then how do you go home, basically, if you have to do your chores, you still need to self-regulate. But what does that mean in that particular context, right? So the question becomes, how do we model, or what do we do to be able to train or teach children, teenagers, adults, to be able to do that, right? So that's a big problem, and that's something I think now with the focus on lifelong learning, right, and training, and especially training the future workforce, right, which becomes such a big issue that we need to focus on. So the question becomes, what kind of research should we be doing to be able to establish those practices? Is that
because when you think of it from a self-regulated learning end, or even just the general concept of self-regulation, it's in a lot of ways not central to curriculum. I think places like the U.S. where you have a lot of standardized testing, and it's really knowledge oriented. And one of the things you often hear, whether it's from accounting firms or agencies that go out and say, hey, these are the new skills that are needed, or World Economic Forum puts out these top 10 skills needed in the future, and they're not skills like knowing stats or knowing how to program. They're quite often skills that are between people. They're interpersonal skills. And that's where something like self-regulated learning, even the way you were describing it, is an individual who's able to sort of meet their own needs, monitor their own progress towards goals, and so on. How do you teach these skills then? Because they're not direct instruction skills the way that you might be able to directly teach someone a times table, or teach someone how to program in Python, for example. But how would you instruct or help students develop those capabilities when they're by nature more about being attributes, like who am I as a person versus what do I know?
Yeah, so there are two issues I think related to that. The first one is, unfortunately, at least in the U.S., our teacher training programs, and I can sweeping generalization here, is that our future teachers are not being trained on what it means to self-regulate. So the teachers cannot self-regulate. How are we expecting them to self-regulate or model the self-regulation and foster that in their students, right? So I think that's a big problem, right? You just tell students what to do, and it's basically verbal feedback, right? So very little modeling. So I think that's a problem. The other problem is how do we train exactly? And I think in terms of the literature, we've seen a lot that we can train people on the declarative knowledge. So like, for example, what does making a difference look like, right? So what is an inference? What is a hypothesis? What is monitoring? And we can model that. So we can teach the declarative knowledge. We can also teach the procedure knowledge. And very simply, we can add a video, for example, even let's say to a MOOC, right? They can play over and over again. I think the biggest key is the next step, is how do you teach the self-regulatory conditional knowledge? To teach students that if you really want to be cognitive, flexible, and adaptive, you need to understand how to engage in accurate metacognitive monitoring and accurate skill use, but know the conditions under which you should be using any of those. And by the same time, that makes an assumption that you have a repertoire of those strategies, right? So the question is then how do we also teach that repertoire? So that's the $1 million question, right? Is if we can crack that code, then I think we a lot better self-regulating humans.
Well, so continue on that strand. We've talked a little bit about parents, the importance of obviously monitoring, at a young age, and from a teacher's end, there's modeling dynamics, there's development dynamics. What about from an individual student? Let's say you're an early college student, you're just starting the university experience. Self-regulation is obviously critical to your ongoing academic success. And self-regulation is more than just not procrastinating. And as you mentioned, these aren't single constructs. Like motivation isn't this unitary relationship of flick a switch and now I'm motivated. So what would you suggest if you were to sit down with a group of students early in their starting a university environment and say, what do you need to know about self-regulation and how do you develop it in yourself as a student?
Yeah, I think the first step, and that's an excellent question, and I mean, universities always have those issues, right, with undergrad students, and so the question is, having an honest question with these students, like really kind of, engaging in reflection, if you will, like what do you know, like you know yourself as a student better than anyone else, so what are your strengths and weaknesses? Maybe we can start off with that, and then kind of building on, the strengths, but definitely developing, what you see as weaknesses. So for example, even understanding that, for example, I have very self-efficacy for doing problem solving in physics, but I love biology. So even knowing those differences will start to get you to understand. So that means I got to put more effort into one task or one domain than the others, right? Knowing how to differentiate between skills. But also, I think a lot of this students don't engage in is they don't know what they don't know, right? And the question is, how do you teach that at an individual level, right? So for example, students, we'll see students take copious notes. And they think that just because I spend 5 hours taking notes, I should do well in the exam, right? But then they fail the exam. And they come back, it's like, but I took copious notes. I go, yeah, but you used the wrong strategy. So the question is, not only do you use the wrong strategy, it also shows me that you're not aware that you're monitoring your understanding or the fact that this is a bad strategy for this kind of assessment, right? So do you have to experience failure to be able to kind of pull back and reflect, like, oh yeah, you're right. But we don't do that, right? We give the test and then we just go on with the next chapter, right? And then we do the test again. So there's never really a way to stop and make students reflect. And I think we should be doing that for our students. Yeah, that makes sense. But I bring it back again to so how can technology, right? Both of us do a lot of work in technology. So how can we use technology to facilitate that process of getting them to understand, to self-regulate, and how important it is?
And I can particularly see technology being effective regarding specific cognitive constructs.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you're an educator that sees a group of students interacting, you're primarily what you're seeing, and it's almost like a behaviorist framework. Yeah. You're only seeing the external results of what students are doing. Right. They're perhaps off topic in their conversation, or they might just be looking bored or whatever they're doing. Absolutely. Whereas if somebody engages with, say, a software platform, there are behaviors that can be exhibited. Absolutely. And let's just say it's not let's just say it's a research instrumented environment where you're not necessarily trying to teach broadly in this format because of ethics constraints, but you have students that are, if you will, wired for this kind of data capture. So maybe you can talk a little bit about what does that look like? What kinds of data are you capturing in your work that would help us get to the cognitive constructs that relate to self-regulated learning that an observational teacher wouldn't be able to see just by looking at a classroom?
Sure. Yeah, no, that's a great point, and that brings the issue of starting to focus on beyond self-report measures, and also focusing beyond just basically quizzes or assessments or pre-test, post-test, right? So thinking about collecting multimodal, multi-channel data while a student is interacting with a piece of technology, let's say an intelligent tutoring system, for example, or a serious game. So the easy stuff to capture, obviously, that we can do with screen recording is we'll need screen recordings because we need some kind of context, right, from which to make inferences. But from that, we also get probably a lot of overt strategy use, which can be somewhat, most likely, easy to capture and classify, right? Oh, they're taking notes. Well, it's very, like you were saying, very behavioral. Or they're reading, or they're rereading. But then we get into the, for example, the metacognitive processes. Well, if we can have sensors built into the software, right, not just the student being instrument, but I know that you are reading, let's say, a passage on viruses, and then you engage in taking notes, and then you go back and reread. Well, now you've gone back and reread. So we are making an inference that because you are rereading, you are probably monitoring, but the question is, why are you going back to reread? Is it something you still don't understand? Right, so it's hard. So we can capture them, we can make inferences, but we have to be very careful about the inferences we're making, because if we then have some kind of AI component, let's say an avatar, right, that's embedded in the system, and it's going to intervene, we better make sure that it's making the right inference, right, and intervening at the right time and with the right method, if you will, right. The other thing is, so those are, metacognition, or we can actually include, some kind of self-report method that's in there, kind of like based on the self-assessment. We can also look at facial expressions, right? I mean, every laptop now and desktop has a camera, so we can turn it on, so we can look at, what emotions, your transitions emotions, the duration, the co-occurrence of emotions. So, for example, let's say, we know that's a really challenging chapter in a MOOC, and for example, we know that you're now going from very neutral to now you're showing confusion, right? The system is not intervening because it's not intelligent. Now you're transitioning to frustration, and we know, at least from the literature, now you're probably going to be disengaged because you're just going to give up, right? And then once that's done, forget it, we've lost a student, right? I think the biggest problem, though, and we can use this multimodal data, so we'll use eye tracking to see if we can detect, for example, specific strategies or metacognitive processes. We can do concurrent think-aloud protocols. Facial expressions of emotions, screen recordings, physiological data, even though that's still a little bit up in the air, because yes, we can collect your physiological data, but what does it actually mean? Right? It's so hard to interpret, right? The biggest nut to crack is the motivation. Yes, we can include self-report measures. Let's say it's part of an interface. It could be part of an open learner model, for example. But what do? Do we prompt students? It's like, oh, now it's been 10 minutes. Tell me how interested you are in this topic, like a slider. Or do we have this strategy, this component of this interface is here. If your level of interest changes, then you access it and you tell the system that it has changed, either more or less, right? So I think we've got to experiment with some of these techniques, for example. But it's really about making inferences, and that's what makes a lot of people uncomfortable, is that, right, as psychologists, we're making a lot of inferences based on these verbal and nonverbal behaviors, right, using these sensors. So
based on what you were just sharing, Roger, around some of the dynamics of self-regulation and the ways that you collect data to get at the concept of self-regulation, I mean, it's not really new, because if you look at it, just the history of psychology, initially, one of the approaches that was prominent, and this is, we're talking 100 and some years ago, was the idea of introspection, because we can, the brain, the mind, the behavior, how do these three intersect to produce insight for a researcher or for a teacher? And so with introspection, it was you were trained how to write down and share what was going on in your head. Unfortunately, there's a lot of subjective stuff, because I might say I'm a 10 on a pain scale, and let's say I'm a soccer player who are generally known to be soft. And I'm a 10 on a pain scale, but somebody else what I'm experiencing could be a 2. So there's so much subjectivity. So psychologists wanted to obviously develop a rigorous, structured science. And so you have to eliminate subjectivity as much as you can, and you really turn more towards Kantian methods where you have to trace back from what you're seeing, and a lot of it is inference based. A lot of what you're doing is you're treating something as a proxy for behavior, and accumulating enough evidence over a long enough period of time gives you confidence that yes, these behaviors coupled with these circumstances and these whatever ideas or data collection mechanisms you're using, facial patterns, EEG or fMRI data, and so on, start to give you a degree of confidence that you're actually getting at things like self-regulation and you're getting at things like confusion. So I just wanted to articulate that some of the questions here aren't necessarily a unique set of questions facing self-regulated learning. They're questions that anyone that studies human behavior deals with, is what are the right proxies that give us insight into mind and brain, and what can we do with those proxies, so to speak, to make appropriate inferences in different situations.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So with that brief soliloquy out of the way, what about the movement in the subdomain of psychology called positive psychology? There's been a lot of attention being paid to things like mindfulness and other activities that help promote, and all the buzzwords, the growth mindset, the grit, the perseverance. How does that relate to self-regulated learning? And can someone who adopts mindfulness practices in their day, whether it's in the form of an app or through meditation practices, does that help develop those capabilities?
That's an interesting question. What I don't like, and as a psychologist, what I don't like about what we see in psychology and in the popular press is the coinage of some of these terms like mindfulness and grit and all that. And the question becomes, look, we already have so many high-level abstract constructs like self-regulated learning, for example, or metacognition, that does it really help, or does it actually confuse us by coining these terms? Because sure, any scientist could, I can think about grit. Well, is grit mean somebody who's more persistent? And if we're persistent, I can go down the motivation pipeline and say, well, I can find a motivation theory that could accommodate, theoretically and probably empirically, grit. But the question is, do we need another construct, right? And then what I find is that then the problem is that then lay people and also teachers and sometimes instructors pick up on these like mindset, right? And they pick up on this, and then all of a sudden there's curriculum changes that are not really empirically based, but all of a sudden somebody's invested lots of money and lots of time. Now we're going to be teaching our kids based on mindset. And it's like, really? But where's the evidence? So it's like we get into these fads, we implement them, and then somebody's going to come up with a meta-analysis to show that it's negligible or very small effect size. So the question then becomes, like, we're back to square one until somebody coins a new term, right? So the question from our perspective is, why come up with new terms? Let's use the terms we already have, and there's already kind of disharmony, if you will, because even within self-regulation, people are misusing some terms or not operationally defining the terms. That let's just use what we already have, and then the question is, can we apply it to different contexts and modify it? So I don't know if that kind of answers the question.
It does, because, and I think one thing that's interesting, because what's new gets attention, right? There's something about the human brain, whether you take the Pirellian card sort of framework that we forage for information, and novelty is a motivating thing. So somebody says mindset, and it's like, oh, well, that means X, and grit, and you can go to a school board meeting if you're in the primary, secondary school level, and you can say, we need more growth mindsets in our curriculum, and if you break it down to an operational construct, it's all there already in literature. But I think sometimes it's the naming convention that really is just sort of a repackaging to generate new levels of interest.
That's right.
The problem, though, still remains exactly what you're articulating, is that you end up having ideas that are brought into classrooms that are removed from the core science, that they are now opinion and certain level of application, and all kinds of fuzziness comes in with it. And universities, schools in particular, I should say, the primary, secondary school systems, they're contested space. They're political spaces. They're where, if you have a viewpoint, you want that reflected in the curriculum, because that changes the future generations. So
I know, absolutely, I agree completely. And so even to use mind-wandering, I mean, that's one of the new ones, right? Getting a lot of attention. And so the question is, okay, sure, mind-wandering is interesting. I could see how we can use mind-wandering as part of a self-regulatory process model, right? And it's important for learning and instruction. The question is also, I think we also make the assumption, we really talk about this, that students, think about humans. If we were to be accurate and regulating, and in terms of our metacognition and emotions, etc., 24/7,
I mean, we would be very much depleted. I mean, it takes a lot of resources. So the question then, if you think about mind-wandering, I mean, is it students off task? Are they thinking about something? Like, what exactly are they doing? And maybe a little bit of mind-wandering is a good thing, right? I mean, maybe you're resetting, you're thinking about, you're reflecting.
Well, see, I think you're raising a good point
right.
there around like human beings are not computers.
That's right.
Right.
Yep.
There is a lot of avenue for, or almost need for sloppiness.
Yep.
You know, that's why we love story, we love analogy because it's, you know, we don't think in computational mechanisms.
That's right.
We think with emotion and affect, and we think with stories and novel ideas and concepts. So, you know, there needs to be
absolutely.
room to not turn humans into computational entities.
That's right. That's right.
So at some level then when you get to technology
Yep.
and the incorporation of technology and self-regulated learning,
Sure.
it's about looking at what does technology do well to support our self-regulation.
Absolutely.
And what are things that should just be handed over to technology completely because it outperforms human beings in that regard.
That's right. Yeah.
Do you know if there's a barrier? Is there, like, how would you articulate
Yeah.
what should be used technologically to augment our cognitive performance versus what should just be said, you go do this?
Sure. Yeah, and that's a great question. I mean, especially at this intersection, especially in terms of the work that you and your collaborators and your team is doing at your center, is this if we are to augment human cognition, then what are we augmenting, right? So, can we look at what are we really poor or bad at as humans, right? Yeah. So, for example, well, I have a limited working memory capacity, so I can't pay attention to everything. You're giving me this physics chapter that is overwhelming. Yeah. So why not, if I knew that about myself, maybe a good adaptive self-regulator would be, well, you, machine, you tell me and highlight for me what is relevant for me to do, because now you're helping me. I know what my needs are. I know what you do best, which is basically compute, right? So you tell me what's relevant, right? So I can study more strategically. So the question is finding out who the human is, right? Either from themselves or from data, right? What they're really bad at or poor at. And then can we design the machine or instruct the machine, right, to help us to support that, right? Or it could be just as simple as, look, I'm looking at this diagram. You want me to understand this process, this biological process. I'm looking at this diagram. I have no idea what's relevant. Well, that's a simple thing. A machine can actually, you can use perceptual cueing. Look at this, look at that. Okay. Well, can we take it to the next level? Now you're highlighting what's relevant, but I still have low prior knowledge. I don't know why that's relevant. Machine, tell me why that's relevant, right? Can we take it a next step? Now you tell me why that's relevant, but it's like, okay, well, that's relevant. I'm going to be assessed in a couple of days or weeks in this class. How should I study, right? Based on the fact that you tell me that this is relevant, because I don't know how to study for this, because my usual mode would be to take notes and that's not useful, or to draw a beautiful rendition of this diagram, which is completely useless. It's basically going to be a waste of time. So how can we build that relationship? And really it will force us to think about the relationship in human and machines, right? To take advantage of both. Yeah. But really focus on the human, right? We need to augment the human to be more effective, right?
Well, and that seems to be an ongoing issue in society in general, because there have been a number of reports over the last few years that sometimes they share horrific numbers like, 50% of the labor market or 50% of the jobs are going to be obsolete. And sometimes they're a little more sane, like, well, it's going to be closer to 10, 15%, which is still a massive number. So there's very little doubt that there will be automation of things like vehicles and public transport, and even in the U.S. there's a risk of millions of truck drivers, for example, being automated and so on. So then the question is, in a future economy, which our role as, whether it's a K-12 system or a university system, a part of our responsibility is to prepare individual for meaningful engagement in this future world. So how do you start to do that at a level where it seems like core knowledge ideas, which can be easily discovered, prior knowledge, which can be needed knowledge at a baseline for application later. What's important, if you don't have that base knowledge like you just articulated, then a machine could say, well, this is important, so I'll just give you this now.
That's right.
So it's less consequential. So it seems like a lot of what is anticipated for future knowledge needs fit into this domain of soft skills, self-regulated learning, ways of being, if you will, collaborating, connecting with others, and so on. What does that look like for you if you were to say preparation of students in the long run in terms of the mindsets that self-regulated learning can help promote?
Sure, yeah. So it would really force us to think about what are those core self-regulatory processes, right? Both metacognitive, affective, motivational, and processes. What are they, and are they domain independent, right? And also, and then by domain independent, I'm extending it also to kind of across different workforce sectors,
Right.
right? If we knew what those were, can we design a training system that would train humans, right, to perform tasks that would cut across education and, let's say, industry and training sectors, right?
Yeah.
So that we are training them to be able to not only apply those strategies, but also transfer them across tasks. Would that be one method, right? But I think we need to take it to the next level, which is then how do you really train humans to learn how to learn?
Yeah.
Right. Well, I go back to that conditional knowledge. Like, I know that this strategy, I'm monitoring this strategy is not really working for me, and I'm getting really frustrated. All right, so well, how are you going to diffuse that? And that's an issue that we still don't understand is, if you were to collect all this multimodal data, let's say with an AI machine for future training of humans, right, is if you have issues with cognition in your affect and your motivation and metacognition, well, which one do you take care of first? Do I have to tackle your motivation? Because if you're not motivated, then what's the use of training you how to use sophisticated strategies, right? Because you're not going to care, right? Well, what about emotions? Is emotions going to be second, or is it first? Or does it depend on context, or does it depend on the individual himself or herself, right? So there's so many of these open-ended questions that we need a lot more. But I think this kind of learning to learn, right? If we had an AI system that would actually teach people to do that, could be the first step towards addressing some of these workforce issues.
Yeah. Well, so I recently read an article in New York Times which talked about the rise of the Anticollege, which is different from the Antichrist. And so there was a lot of attention being paid to a growing group of parents and individuals who, just from a learning process, that decide that they're not as interested or committed, if you will, to the traditional university model. Because university model as it is now is really about there's a chunk and a body of knowledge you need to have, you put it into a student, they graduate, and a lot of it is about employment, and it's about specific knowledge that's been acquired. So with this anti-college movement, the interest seems to be, which isn't novel, I mean, it seems to be a return, if you will, to Plato's academy, or Aristotle, sort of the Lyceum, engaged, active, ongoing involvement. It could be what comes out of the apprenticeship model, where you work closely with a master carpenter, and in the process you learn not only the skills of carpentry, but you learn what does it mean to be a carpenter, because there's so many soft skills tied in with the knowledge skills as well. So, and so at some point, where we are at a time in society, it seems like there's growing pushback to what technology is doing to us, what it's making us, and there's almost a desire to sort of reclaim our humanity in this kind of a landscape. And a lot of the self-regulated learning elements seem to fit nicely in with that, because you're saying, no, this is something that you do there, and you've mentioned several examples. Well, this can be automated, this can be done by AI, this can be done by this. Would you argue then, or would you support the argument that by adding more technology to the learning process, adding more of an AI supporting infrastructure, that what we're able to do is free up our cognitive effort, our mental energy to be better at being a creative, vibrant, engaged human being? Would that be an argument you'd support?
Yeah, absolutely. If we automate as much as we can, right? Yes, that would. We ask the question like you're asking, which is basically what does a human do? Right. Yeah. But if you had more time to be more creative, to think about whether it's art or just to be creative in general, right? To think, and is that what we need to kind of, as we think about the evolution of even humanity, right? And kind of reclaiming, like you're saying, our time, because right now everything is so scheduled, so it's all about efficiency, it's all about performance. So if we were able to decrease that pressure that we're putting on ourselves and also our youngsters, right, in terms of future workforce, and also our children, whether it's in the schools or as parents, what would that do, right? And so it almost seems like you're also making the argument that we would, if we rely less on technology, then of course then you have to rely more on yourself as a learner, and self-regulation becomes even more important, because now you don't have a tool that could potentially facilitate or augment what we don't have or can't do. right? So I don't know if that
That's
makes
kind of like
sense.
you look at calculators in schools, for
Yeah.
example. I mean, there was a time where you had to learn your times tables. You had to be
Yeah.
able to do long division, and at a certain point, there's a movement away from that kind of
Mm-hmm.
curriculum, recognizing that things like study skills, habits of thought, habits of mind are more consequential for long-term success.
Mm-hmm.
And that is just fine if you figure out that you hit 9 times 9 on your calculator,
Yeah.
and that's all you need to know.
Sure.
Because so we already have that area where we've passed things off
Sure.
to technology, and we're comfortable with it because once you're aware, you're like, yeah, well, that allows me to solve these problems,
problems,
rather
yeah.
than to be consumed with the mechanics of solving the problem. I can start talking about
Sure.
solutions or the ways to impact
Yeah.
that problem. So just final question before we wrap up
Yeah.
then is, what are the ethics of some of the instrumentation activities?
Mm-hmm.
What are the dynamics of people who are uncomfortable with a society of perpetual surveillance? What does that look like in your research?
Yeah, that's always one of the major concerns that we have, right? We want and agree to provide people, anonymity and privacy. But how do we handle that in a society where, yes, we are, it's not just that you're instrumented because you're wearing a bracelet that gives me access to physiology, or I'm collecting eye tracking data so I can see exactly, what you're looking at. But even in the ambient environment, I mean, it can have sensors. Eventually, I mean, our walls will be intelligent, so they will be able to hear, feel, and think, which sounds very scary, but it's very doable, right? But think about it in a classroom context. I mean, if we're working together and the teachers all the way across the room can't reach us in time, I would be inclined to perhaps enjoy having a virtual human that can come and help us because they're available, right? And what does that look like? So the question, I think, is that balance between how much of your freedom and liberty and, do you want to share with others, even though they may be conceived as it's at home, so it's your parents, or it's in the classroom, right? But I think where people get, and I also get very antsy, is when others, where you have no control, whether they're companies or the government, will start having access to these data and then use those data against us, right? Whether it's denying health insurance, for example, at least in the US, right, which is a big problem, or just selling our data to others. I think we need a lot more ethics and not only, more governance in terms of the ethical behavior regarding this kind of data collection, right? And we have to respect people's privacy, and if they don't want you to collect particular types of data, then we have to respect that, right? So the question then becomes, can we invent or design other methods or other proxies for those processes that may include other sensors or devices?
And then just awareness, like
Or
the
an
awareness
awareness.
that people
Yeah.
have. Because
Yeah.
I think a lot of individuals, especially with what we see with social media, Facebook
Sure.
and Twitter, a lot of individuals were unaware, at least in the U.S.,
Yes.
pre-2016 election, at the amount of data and the ability for potentially shaping the behavior of individuals
Absolutely.
based on those data. Because the psychological attributes, we're not intentionally communicating who we are when we post something in Facebook, for example, but by virtue of the clicks that we follow, the people that we engage with, our friend network, I may never have a political opinion declared on social media, but if you look at who I'm following, the people in my network, who I'm engaging with, you can definitely infer a lot about who I am based on how and to whom I'm connected on an ongoing basis. So there's a lot of questions that relate to how do you make people aware of the ethical dimensions of data use as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, the awareness and the control, and who's controlling that information, right? That could be beyond your capabilities or your knowledge, like you're saying, that awareness, right? So yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, Roger, thanks for your time.
Thank you so much, George.